This lesson is about statistics. We're going to cover some of the basic vocabulary of statistics that we're going to use. So first of all, when we've been talking about statistics, we want to really recognize that when we talk about statistical questions, it's really talking about questions that can be answered by collecting data. Now, statistical variables could be any kind of quantity that can be measured or a quality that can be measured. So we might look at categorizing things, or we might look at quantifying things. So those would be two main types of variables. A categorical variable, where we put things into categories like colors, or for instance, types of clothes that are worn. Or we could talk about a quantitative variable where we put a number quantity to it. So those are different statistical variables. Now when we look at the actual gathering of data, we want to know that if we're talking about a population, that's all members in a group. So if we're looking at everybody and we're gathering data from that, that would be a population. So a sample, on the other hand, would be where we actually take a subset of a population. So a smaller group from that population, that would be one that we would gather information from. Now, a parameter, what it is the actual data value for the entire population. So, so it's a data value that describes the population. So it's the actual number when we gather all the information about a certain piece of data. What is that data value? A statistic, on the other hand, is when we gather that data for a smaller sample. Okay, so a data value from a sample usually used to understand or predict or know something about the parameter itself. So we don't know what the parameter is, but we can gather data from a smaller sample to understand what that one is, or maybe predict it or estimate it. Now, when we're looking at different types of studies that we could do if we're gathering samples, those types of studies could be, for instance, a sample survey, or doing an experiment or an observational study. So those are different ways we could gather that sample data. Now, we do need to know that sampling could involve bias. So we want to try to involve bias, because what bias really does is it involves misrepresenting the data. We gather a statistic that helps us, makes us look at a number that is not pointing toward the actual parameter. It's misrepresenting what that parameter of the population is. Now, different ways we could do that sampling. We could do stratified sampling, which we take a group of people and we take a sampling from each of those groups. We could do cluster sampling, just gather convenient clusters, like groups that are already together, and select at random. We could do systemic sampling, which means we use some type of rule for selecting at random different members for that sample. And we could do, now those would be ones that hopefully we could avoid bias by using. But if we have a high risk of bias is when we do sampling like convenient sampling, where we just kind of look around us and gather information from what's easy to gather information from. Or we could do self-selected sampling, where we just look for volunteers, people that want to help with that data. Those are high risk of bias, so we want to instead look for the other ones to try to avoid the bias as part of the situation. Now we're going to look at a couple other vocabulary words we need to be aware of. The random sample is where we take we have each person in the group have an equal chance of being selected for sampling. Also, experimental group it's where it receives the treatment of whatever our experiment is, if we're using that type of a study. Or a control group does not receive the treatment. It's like the placebo group for it. Right, so now what we're going to do is talk about the members of center and the measures of spread. The measures of center usually are either mean, the median, or the mode. Now these, the mean is the average of everything. Add up all the number of quantities and divide by the number of data sets in the data set. Median is the very middle of it, and if we have two numbers in the middle, so there's no actual middle number, we average those two in the middle to get the median. And the mode is the data number that's given the most, or the category that's used the most. Now measures of spread, usually what we use for these is we use the standard deviation. The standard deviation we'll talk about when we do the normal distribution. It's calculated as a measure of how wide the data gets to. Or sometimes we use for the interquartile range. Interquartile range is where we find the first quartile and the third quartile, which are it's the median of the lower half of data and the median of the upper half of data, and we just subtract them to get how far apart they are. So those tell us how wide the data set is. Okay, and we've already talked about sampling and bias. We would use hopefully sampling bias to a way to design a sampling method to avoid bias in order to gather our data. So this is the vocabulary that we're using, kind of the building blocks for this statistical study that we're talking about. We want to use these properly in terms of how we design statistics, both scientifically and also to encourage having a proper use of the data and the numbers or the categories to describe what information we're going through with the data set.